from there, because the big B word, we go around this circle often, don't we? What has been the impact of Brexit, or what will be the impact of Brexit? The Office for Budget Responsibility basically says that Brexit has been as damaging to the UK's economy as the coronavirus pandemic. He reckons leaving the EU will get rid of about 4% of our GDP. Ben Habib, is he right?
He is absolutely wrong. And I think it's outrageous that someone who heads up something that's ostensibly an independent body designed to keep the government on the straight and narrow is coming out with their own effectively their own political views. This isn't the first time Richard Hughes has said this. He said this back in 2021. He didn't say then that it was worse than lockdowns. And I'm going to make a distinction between COVID and lockdowns. It's lockdowns to which he's really referring. He didn't say then in 2021 that it was worse than lockdowns, but he did say that the economy would shrink by 4%. And during the course of 2021, which was the first year in which we left the EU single market, the economy actually grew by over 7%. It was one of the leading growth economies in the G7. So he's fundamentally wrong at a factual level. And if you look at what happened to the economy during lockdowns, the economy did shrink within a year by 4%. Immediately, because of lockdowns. We added 33% to the national debt, £500 billion, and the after effects of those lockdowns we're now feeling, which are significant. Taxes at an all-time high, national debt at an all-time high, inflation at an all-time high, the labour market's broken, the NHS broken. So Richard Hughes, who, by the way, is an old member of the Treasury, having worked there since the year 2000. He had a stint in the French Ministry of Finance. He was also at the IMF for a long time. All these organisations are basically pro-Remain. And what Richard Hughes is doing, and it's incredibly irresponsible, it should be called the Office of Budget Irresponsibility after these comments, what he's effectively doing is using his position as chairman of the OBR to espouse his political views. And I actually think he should be called to task on it, and he should be dismissed. But he won't, because these independent bodies have no checks and balances on them. They are empowered to espouse their views without control.
In short, Ben Habib is having none of it.
He isn't, is he? He absolutely isn't.
Are you?
I think it's a shame that we can't have a grown-up and sensible conversation about the effects of Brexit on the economy. And I'm not saying that you're not having a
grown-up... Yeah, we are. That's
No. I mean, we are. But I think the problem is that people have gone, no, we mustn't mention Brexit. There has been a readiness to blame a lot of our economic woes on COVID and the war in Ukraine, both of which are true.
Lockdowns.
Well, lockdown, COVID...
Yeah, the response to COVID.
But, you know, those things are true. But I think, and you will surely accept this, Ben, as a businessman, that the biggest thing that is the biggest anathema to business is uncertainty. And I think when we went into the referendum and came out the other side of it, there was no plan. Now, that was what, 2016? We had 6 years to work out what was going to happen when we did leave. And there was no plan. Despite Boris Johnson's claims that everything was going to be marvellous and it was all going to be tickety-boo and boosterish and naysayers and all the other piles of inverted piffle that he came out with. And I think it's really important for people, particularly business people and particularly small business people, to be able to say, no, it's crucified me. Uncertainty, lack of labour. We know there's a shortage of labour because a lot of people went back to European countries. The extra bureaucracy, the not knowing about bureaucracy. I mean, last week we were talking about Northern Ireland and what it's done there to trade. So I think we need to have a conversation about it. I think, you know, I think your criticism of Richard Hughes is probably a little unfair, I have to say.
Well, I mean, I think it is irresponsible for someone who heads up the Office of Budget Responsibility to be effectively espousing political views and justifying them through the economy, for which he has no evidence. In fact, the evidence goes the other way, because we grew, as I said, by over 7% when we left the EU single market. And that's That's effectively Brexit.
But he would, if he was sitting here instead of me, he would say, no, here is the evidence to say.
But he hasn't.
Lost this,
he hasn't even put a time frame on how long it'll take for the economy to shrink by 4%. This is a number he's concocted without justification, and he's been trotting it out for a couple of years. And now he's added to his bag of tricks the fact that, in his view, Brexit is worse than lockdowns. Nothing could be more damaging to the economy than lockdowns. National debt up by 33%. Do not underestimate the damage that has done to the United Kingdom's economy. It is phenomenal. But I just want to pick up on one thing. I agree with you, Joe. There was no plan. And part of the problem with not having a plan is that Boris Johnson, with his 80-seat majority, did not take advantage of all the freedoms Brexit would have given us. So, for example, we have all the EU statutes still on our books that we had when we left the EU single market. We haven't diverged. We haven't deregulated. We haven't taken our knee, as it were, off the neck of businesses. The private sector is still fettered. We have very high taxation on the private sector, going up next week from 19% corporation tax to 25%. All these things are the kind of socialist government that you would expect in Europe, and not what you would expect in a first world capitalist country like the United Kingdom, which Brexited in order to jettison all that nonsense, and we haven't done it.
No, and that is down to Boris Johnson. And,
Agreed.
And as you say, his
Agreed.
80-seat majority, they had plenty of time to work out what... You know, the truth is that David Cameron didn't think that the vote was going to go for leave. He
didn't think.
Albeit closely. And then everybody just went, oh, yeah. And Boris Johnson said it will be marvellous. Well, it clearly hasn't been marvellous. But I think, you know, nobody wants to recreate and revisit those arguments because it has been so divisive for so many people. But I do think we need to be able to have a proper conversation and look at the failings of government and not... just, you know, Michael Gove is quoted in this article and he was responding to Richard Hughes, but he was to go, no, he wouldn't even mention Brexit. But actually there does need to be a little bit of reconciliation.
Well, Michael Gove is conflicted over
Well,
Brexit.
of course he is.
All over, you know, because he championed Brexit.
Well,
he also attacked during the referendum campaign. He attacked experts. Do you remember? He was at the forefront of that.
And Boris Johnson had got 2 articles written, one for and once again.
And I agree with Michael Gove on the experts. I would actually abolish the OBR. It was created.
You'd abolish the experts, all of them. We put them in one room.
I was going to say Michael Gove, actually.
You know, there's undoubtedly a pendulum, and it swings between greater control of state and less control of state. And the pendulum is very much over towards the greater control of state. And we see that in the borrowing statistics and the taxation statistics.
But the trouble is, Ben, you know, you say get rid of experts.
No, I didn't say... I did not. I would abolish the OBR, which is a new construct. Okay. It was only created in 2010. And they're useless. They predicted in November last year, they predicted the national deficit in 22-23 this year would be £177 billion. 4 months on, they're now forecasting it's going to be £99 billion. So all the naysayers who said that Liz Truss couldn't give effect to the tax cuts she wanted to make because actually the country couldn't afford it because the national debt was out of control, she could have done it. The OBR got its numbers wrong. It got them wrong to the tune of 78 billion quid.
But she didn't even go to the OBR, and it cost £30 billion, which people are now paying.
And I would abolish the OBR.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to abolish this conversation. I need to move on. But let me ask you this. We're talking, Joe was referencing then David Cameron saying that there was no plan. The reason that there was no plan, as we just alluded to, is because they didn't think in a million years that Brexit was going to be the outcome. And the reason they didn't think that is because they didn't pay any attention to what I would say was perhaps in some ways the silent majority, the disconnected majority, those people that don't always engage in politics. Because there's often this tendency to look down on those kind of people. One of the things that I worry about is I feel that despite all the goings-on over the last few years, that sentiment still exists today. Do you think that's fair? Do you think that's reasonable? I do think there's a bit of kind of sniffiness about, unless you're really kind of an avid politiker, then you're a bit stupid, you're a bit disregarded, and I really don't like that attitude. And I think actually, rather than looking down on people that are disenfranchised, disengaged, look at why they are that way and seek to re-engage them. Do you think life's moved on from all of that kind of sentiment back back in 2016. It feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?
It does.
does.
It does.